So good morning, and thank you to the symposium organizers. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm really excited for all the conversation today. So I'll begin by explaining this is just a piece of my very early dissertation on which I explore the environmental insights and also the queer ecology of American literary regionalism across the 19th century. And I think it's a period that's interesting. It's after Darwin, it's before environmental politics and gender politics really formalize. And so, what can this period show us about things that Donna Haraway's talking about now, like making kin with other species? So things are pretty strange in this literary movement, as I hope to illustrate here. So I'll begin with a vignette. Yes, from a really celebrated story in literary regionalism by Mary Wilkins Freeman called The Revolt of the Mother. So in this story, Sarah Penn is a housewife, a really good housewife, and parent of two, and she revolts against her husband, rearranging the architecture of the family dairy farm. The drama begins when the husband builds a palatial barn on the site of her promised new home, and this is such a problem for her because their house is so shabby, it's unsuitable to house their daughter's wedding, which is gonna dash her marriage prospects. And so despite her protestation, he builds the new barn, goes off to buy a new horse for the barn. When he comes back, he finds that Sarah's moved the family into the barn, and he's stunned, and she confronts him and gives him a piece of her mind, and then he realizes he should have listened to her all along, and then the family go on living in the barn happily ever after. So, on the surface, this is very much a didactic tale and a pretty didactic body of literature about why husbands should listen to their wives, but underneath the surface, it also sets up a much less expected, to me, parable of how the architecture of the home can hinder or enable a distribution of power across inhabitants, male, female, human, non-human. So Sarah is outraged by her husband's refusal to build her house, but she doesn't object specifically to the prioritization of the farm animals themselves. She says, we've got just as good a right here as new horses and cows. So what I want to argue is that her spatial reorganization expands the familial citizenship to include belonging that emerges through each inhabitant's engagement with the intimacy and privacy of the home, in addition to participation in wider social and economic activities across households and markets and ecotones. In other words, Sarah revises the terms of citizenship to include human domesticity, which not only enhances the creature comforts of her family, but it safeguards their reproductive future. While the husband's environmental practice focuses exclusively on husbandry, Sarah's revision to the terms of the landscape citizenship loosens capitalism's grip on the place. So though the story makes clear it's not about the environment, it's not about environmental changes going on at the time, which people were keenly aware of, but if we read it in this light, I think it offers a kind of land ethic that I think bears a lot in common with bioregionalism, which emerged a century later, and is characterized by the writings of Gary Snyder and also activist Peter Berg, bioregionalist Raymond Dassmann, and landscape architect Robert Thayer. And it sees the local as a foundation for an outwardly radiating concern for the planet, and emerged in the US in the 70s in response to the Clean Air and Water Acts, these big sweeping pieces of legislation that were going to fix environmental issues, and they were concerned that that would actually reduce people's connection with their environments and thus their sense of responsibility. So just as Sarah Penn recognized the harm her husband's regime was doing to their family's future, bioregionalists promote ways of existing in a place that's sustainable for future generations of humans and non-humans. Yet for all their emphasis on regeneration, human reproduction holds still a very marginal position within the movement, much as it does for Sarah Penn's husband in The Revolt of the Mother. And I draw an example from Robert Thayer's he revisits bioregionalism in the early 2000s and sort of sketches out summarizes the path to sustainability, and it offers a kind of example of a success story, which is this cafe named after a local creek that serves local food, and he fleshes out this anecdote by interviewing these two cafe employees who are performing really traditional female labor, and they're female, and he credits with them with nourishing the community and making like the community's kitchen. And so I argue that there's a subtle and unacknowledged female presence that labors in the background of the text. Meanwhile, the bioregionalist himself is there, who's moving through the landscape and inspiring people to live in a better way. And so I think more than mere oversight, these uneven social relations are actually baked into bioregionalism as an idea. And he's participating in a long tradition of environmentalism that's imagined like here we have John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt, the men in wilderness in American environmentalism as our icons. And what I want to open up is this idea that there's also a lineage for environmentalism in American regionalist writing. So this is a table of got Twain and other luminaries from literary regionalism. In the foreground is Mary Wilkins Freeman. And this body of literature was really popular at the time, and then it was fell out of favor in the 20th century, sort of dismissed as sentimental. But it emerged similar to bioregionalism at the end of the 19th century in response to fears of the sort of homogenizing US culture after the Civil War. And so it describes place, and it was sort of revived by feminist critics in the 80s and in literary criticism, and then now people are writing about how these short stories that are often written by women and people of color are incredibly sensitive to the way local places are sort of mutually constituted by like broad global networks. So I look to literary regionalism and protagonists like Sarah Penn to offer a kind of landscape citizenship that brings the human and non-human reproduction into the same sphere, the same domestic sphere. So it's pretty clear, if you take a close look at the story, that Sarah's not a very typical housewife. So for one thing, the chronology of the story doesn't make a ton of sense. They mentions multiple times that the husband and wife have been married for 40 years, and yet they have a son who's still in school and a daughter who's only now becoming the age to get married. And so it's potentially plausible chronologically, but it's unusual. And this is emphasized again and again by the fact that the parents are described as old and sturdy and the kids as young and feeble. So she's really drawing the contrast between the generations, kind of creating a block between them. And then at a more formal level with the punctuation, you can see it's not revolt that's called into question, but her motherhood is called into question with the punctuation. She's the so-called mother of the story. So just again and again, Mary Wilkins Freeman prevents you from reading this as a typical American family. So at the center of the story stands Sarah alone, and she's an individual actor, but she never goes outside the domestic sphere. So this, to me, is a helpful illustration of what literary critic Sarah Enser has recently called the spinster ecology. And she, in her article, mentions this with respect to one of Freeman's colleagues, Sarah Orrin Jewett, who's also a regionalist writer and spinster, as well as environmentalist from the 20th century, Rachel Carson. And so she reads Carson and Jewett together to argue that spinsters have this special privileged position for thinking ecologically because they don't extend themselves into the future via offspring, but they remain concerned with it. They're really concerned about raising future generations. And so as a result, they achieve this special kind of spinster temporality, and they write in a specific intransitive syntax is what she talks about. And this is, I think, really salient because the spinster then is not merely, doesn't engage with the environment as a means to growth and self-expansion, but she lingers in the present. And she doesn't perpetuate or reject the possibility of a future, which is also kind of a revision of queer theory's antisocial thesis, which has been criticized as indifferent to environmental sustainability, and as well as the kind of heteronormativity baked into environmentalism, which often presents our concern for the environment as a concern for future generations of humans. So while Ensor focuses on the temporality of a spinster ecology, I turn to the spatial dimensions that I believe Freeman's story illustrates. Because of her simultaneous withdrawal from traditional family life, but also her confinement within the domestic sphere, the spinster ecologist is uniquely disposed to perceive how the architecture of the home becomes a key tool for reorganizing human culture along ecological lines. And so, like her protagonist, well, more than her protagonist, Mary Wilkins Freeman never married, or she did marry, but she is the archetypal spinster, which I'll explain more in a second. So I'll close with an anecdote, or another writer, another piece of writing from the same period that I think takes what Sarah Penn, the protagonist of Mary Wilkins Freeman's story, is doing and brings in the non-human architecture through her science writing. So like Freeman, Mary Treat married very late and was legally separated from her husband and never had children and supported herself through her writing. So they're problematic, but I think also kind of iconic spinsters of the 19th century. And she was a correspondent of Darwin's and really lauded scientist in her own right. And her 1880 series of articles in Harper's Home Studies in Nature describes the domestic habits of wasps, ants, and spiders, and goes into rich description about how they construct their homes. It's entirely woven with language of domesticity, which it was a great strategy for her because it made her legible in a male-dominated literary marketplace, but also because it awoke her readers to a sense of landscape citizenship. They could relate to nature as sort of in the buildings that they live in. So she, over 15 pages, sketches family life at a really microscopic scale and talks about how male and female insects build their homes, how they are tidy and messy, how they raise their young, and how they pass on the knowledge of their home construction to their children. So here we have an example of how it's not just, and she's all about tidiness, which is matches the discourse of domesticity at the time, though unlike that discourse, she's not concerned about how moral critters are. She's concerned about how rational and intelligent their architecture is. So we've got this tarantula building a tower, and it uses twigs to create a turret, photographed or represented on the right, and so it's all about how orderly the insect domestic sphere is. But like later bioregionalist, she's really concerned for how her own species fails to appreciate this non-human architecture. So one of the images in this article is, here we have Treat in her insect menagerie. And you can see how she's describes herself as demurely and comfortably confined. She uses the word her confinement within a circle of shrubbery, noting down her scientific observations. She's comfortable in her confinement, and this image, we see how the spinster ecologist sort of performs a mode of solitude that's really connected to the world beneath her feet, in her case. And so she's both separating herself and also getting very intimately entwined with other beings. And in particular, she's absorbed in their reproductive habits and really concerned with raising the next generation of insects. So through their spinsterly solitude, Treat and Friedman, and the mothers even that they depict, they resist industrialization and patriarchy via an alternative relationship with reproduction. As spinster ecologists, both Treat and Freeman offer a version of, I think, landscape citizenship that intimates and expands bioregionalism to be more attentive to social inequality.